one. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning for the Antares K-12 series. Today we're focusing on unlocking the power of data analytics for K-12 education. This is the first of a three-part series. Just going to step through digital transformation for the K-12 sector. Today joining me on this webinar is Peter Manoukian from Microsoft, Martin Marek from Antares, and shortly they'll step you through some of the key aspects of what K-12 schools should look for when it comes to data analytics and how to undertake the data digital transformation and some of the drivers and the benefits of doing such for our educators. We all know that the education resources are scarce at times. Our teachers are sometimes overworked, and data can really be one of those great ways to unlock some potential value and tremendous time savings, as well as helping us get better outcomes for our students. So without any further delay, I will throw over to Peter Manoukian from Microsoft. Just a little note as well, we will be putting up some polls, so we'll be asking you a few questions throughout the session. That just helps us guide the content as well around some of the target information we want to give to you as our audience, to make sure that we're giving you the information that is most compelling to your reason for being on this call as well. So once again, thank you, and we'll get some polls going, and over to you, Peter.
Great, thank you, Greg. Good morning to everyone on, I guess, the East Coast and other locations. And if you're joining us from the West Coast, it is still morning for you, probably much earlier. For those of you who I know, thank you. Great to see you. Thank you for joining us. And for any new guests or people that I haven't met before, lovely to have you on the call, and really look forward to hopefully continuing this conversation as we progress down our data journey. Peter Manoukian is my name. I'm the Asia Education Lead across Australia and New Zealand, but I do work very closely with independent schools and Catholic schools in particular across the country as well. So before we kick off, probably worthwhile just very briefly I'd like to share with you Microsoft's education team mission, and that is to empower every learner, educator, and institution to achieve more. And this is it's a very people-centric goal that's enabled by technology, and we want to use the power of data, AI, and analytics to make a difference to individuals and their communities with a diverse range of skills, cultures, and backgrounds. So we believe this mission is especially important in education as we teach the leaders and citizens of tomorrow. So let's talk about how technology compare with education and the opportunities we see on the horizon. To start with, new technologies like data, analytics, and AI can help personalize learning. We'll learn more about that in a little bit of as we go through this deck and as Martin takes us through the next sections. But in particular, data, AI, and analytics can help personalize learning, which is a major trend we're seeing across the industry at the moment. We'll learn more about this later, but in short, data and insights can also help teachers quickly create learning content that's tailored to students' learning levels, and it also ensures that we get targeted learning support for each individual student, which is incredibly important for students today. Helping students also to build the foundational skills that they'll need to prepare for the future, such as decision-making and communication skills are essential for success in higher education and the workplace and beyond later in life. For school staff in particular, new technologies can help them to do their jobs more efficiently, and we keep, in particular, teachers just simply don't have enough time, and wherever we can free up teachers to allow them to focus more on students is absolutely important. And also, we'd have to mention security of staff and the use of data and AI and analytics and other advancements to protect sensitive data while also boosting productivity. Finally, educators can also use data, analytics, and AI to save time on everyday tasks so they can spend more quality time with students. But let's see how this plays out across education today. So at the heart of education transformation is essentially data. And this has been already used to boost inclusivity and productivity, and recent advancements that present opportunities to reimagine education. It's inspiring to consider the opportunities we have to realise transformative potential of data and analytics, and in a variety of different ways, such as developing new learning tools, providing an aid for creating content, building tech literacy, improving student services, and simplifying and scheduling more efficiently. And at the heart of education transformation is data. Scroll to the next slide. And data and information is essentially the fuel that enables continuous improvement. The key concept here is that all aspects of education operations produce data, and whether it be data relating to students, to staff, to services that they consume, or overall school operations. My apologies, let's just skip ahead. And if we start at the top left-hand corner, looking at engaging students, we think about the data that's being processed when students use, for example, the learning management system, or other student services when, for example, when staff produce content or recordings for classes. When support services or enrolment services are activated, again, a volume of data is generated and is drawn upon to give insights to the school in more accurate decision making. School operations, including campus management and building management, and the idea that these processes all feed into each other and as part of a constant feedback loop. And this is where data is essentially the fuel for ongoing innovation. I've just built this slide out. There we go. And with all the various different data repositories that most schools interact with today, the reality is this diagram is a reflection of the data estate across many schools and the data at a high level architecture, where we find multiple siloed data lakes and with lots of potential for duplication of that data. And this can lead to a lot of challenges for any school that we speak to. And often the school IT teams spend excessive amount of time reconciling and standardizing that data and managing the disparate systems. And this can potentially impact overall productivity. So there's a lot of opportunities where we can start to look at where streamlining the interaction and the integration between these systems, but also maintaining these multiple data lakes requires more infrastructure and IT resources, which can drive up cost and can make it more difficult to provide insights. So this is a very common bit of feedback we get from every school just about we speak to, who are looking at reviewing their existing data estate or potentially looking at what a modern data estate may look like moving forward. Another common bit of feedback we hear from schools, but not unique to education institutions, is data silos. Continue to be a persistent problem. So ask yourself, is your data discoverable by those who need it within your school? And is it reliable? Or are you missing opportunity to surface new insights for teachers and administrative decision makers? And also have a think about your data architecture and governance. Has your data architecture just evolved organically over time? This is quite common to hear this bit of feedback. And also, are there security issues potentially arising due to this explosion in tools, making it harder to apply data governance? And finally, data privacy and ethical use of data is often a major concern. So I'd ask, are there systems in place to protect your school's sensitive data today? Or could we potentially be working smarter through the choice of tools? And to help solve some of these challenges, we've seen the introduction of what we call the Fabric One Lake. And when I think about the Fabric One Lake, one easy way to describe or an analogy that I often use is think of OneDrive and how you use OneDrive for your files and documents. Well, OneLake is similar for all your data. And Fabric is extensible enough to cater for a variety of different data types. And it also satisfies all your data processing needs, regardless of what analytic engines you choose to run against that data. And that is also achieved through Fabric's support of multi-cloud environments, because we recognize most schools have a myriad of different platform providers. So Fabric is extensible enough and compatible with those different platform providers, but it's also just as equally compatible with your on-premise data. And it stores the data in an open Delta Parquet format for this compatibility and ensures governance and compliance. So in this next section, I'll hand over to Martin to walk us through Fabric in a little bit more depth and provide us some more detail. Over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Peter. So my name's Marty Merrick. I'm part of the Antares Data and AI team, and my main predominant focus is working with K-12 schools, and I've worked with over 40 schools to help them along in their data journey and in various steps. And I see a lot of common themes across, working across that time period. I see a lot of common themes across a lot of these schools. And I wanted to just talk about, I suppose, the three main buckets that we often come across in terms of where a school might be at within those, within that data journey. So firstly, I wanted to talk about, a school that potentially hasn't really started to embark on a data management platform or doesn't really have a sort of unified strategy in place. Of course, they have a lot of data scattered across, as Peter mentioned, often in various silos. Of course, we often see things like an SMS and LMS in place to keep student data and results across a period of time. And so typically when we talk to schools like that, we often talk about as a very first step is to understand where those data sources are. So what are the systems do I have in place? How do I capture data? And how do I store that data? And how do I get access to that data? So identify how can I extract that data in an easy to use way, and sort of start moving away from the Excel sort of manual based processes that are often in place in these scenarios. Then once we understand where all these sort of main pockets of data assets are, it's important to then prioritize what are the key assets that I can hone in on and potentially start to create a sort of unified data approach around. So that might be, student focused or student centric. Often it's around, say, semester reporting or continuous reporting across results. It might be sort of behavioral type data. It might be NAPLAN or, sort of testing type data that's being looked at, or a combination of these different data assets to correlate between and look at trends across these data sets as well, to potentially identify early interventions for students. So that's a sort of typical conversation early on. Or there might be operational requirements as well. So we have HR and finance departments within schools, of course, that have various types of reporting. And of course, there's some privacy and security concerns around that as well. But again, we can look at those data assets as a potential priority for those groups, and build some trends and some analytics around, as an example, to forecast, when will I need to hire additional teachers based on teacher age and retirement plans and and growth within the school as well. So it just gives us that sort of strategic view of data that we might not have had prior. So bucket number one is really where we've got a lot of data, but we haven't really started to provide a data strategy around that. And that's where sort of these key steps come into play. Now, sometimes we come across a school that does have some approach already in play. That might be that they've identified, hey, we've got some core systems here that we know there is some important information in. We want to, maybe they've started extracting some of that into potentially some Excel reporting or some Power BI reporting initially. And there are some clear use cases that are definitely providing some value. So the next step really here is to begin that journey towards a unified data management platform. So that means rather than moving just into Power BI as a source sort of reporting mechanism and maybe some Excel around the school, we begin to move towards a unified strategy. So moving our workloads into Microsoft Fabric, for example, and providing access to that in a secure way to the people that need that data and strategically provide them with insights, as I mentioned, around trends for students or operational type information. And this is where we can start developing some processes around how we actually engage with the business. So oftentimes what we come across here is, IT generally drives these sort of initiatives initially, but as they scale up, IT then becomes over incumbent with a lot of requests. And so, typically it becomes very difficult for a smaller IT team at a K-12 school to manage that scale. So it's important to put in processes into place that help with the automation, or at least things like a service catalog, or at least as a known process around the school into, as a teacher or a learning and teaching curriculum staff, how do I engage with the appropriate people and the processes to be able to deploy a new dashboard that I need, for example. So it's important to put the owners back on the business to own their data, but then allow them freedom and provide them with the process of how they can develop further insights from that data as well. So in this second case, where we have some clear use cases, they're the sort of main items that we work towards. Now, we might come across sometimes a school that has actually developed quite a lot of the dashboards already, have a unified data strategy in place, or we may have worked with them along that journey to get them to the point where the school now has a unified data strategy, ingesting information from various sources, correlating those sources together, providing some insights and valuable additional information is being disseminated across the school. The question here is, how do we continue to innovate and develop further insights out of those data assets? And typically, and one of the buzzwords of the moment is AI. One of the major things that we can definitely work on and definitely establish clear insights from is AI-driven workloads using the data underneath. So, and the reason why this is in the third bucket is that sometimes, whilst we can provide some AI-driven initiatives without having gone through the journey, so without having to develop a unified strategy first, it's important to understand that it is a lot clearer and easier to establish an AI strategy once you have good quality data assets. So once you've done some data validation, some data quality processes are in place, you might have some data custodians in place. It's a lot easier to establish an AI strategy because you can rely on those data assets. So what that means is once we have this unified data management platform and those key processes in place, we can then begin to introduce things like predictive analytics. So predictive analytics, as an example, might be, I worked with a school that wanted to predict ATAR scores, for example. Those predictions were based all the way from very, very early childhood, so from primary school, demographics, results, behavioral information. So all sorts of different data points were being used and correlated together to identify what the trends for that student are over the long term and what potential factors might drive success for that student. So you can develop interventions for those students that need it much, much earlier in life, rather than getting to, later in high school years where, that trend has been trending downwards for a long period of time. and becomes a lot difficult to change those habits later on. So we can create these predictive and prescriptive models using AI with the data that you already have available, and that, these are some of the innovations that you can, as a school, bring into play to get better outcomes for your students, right? And also helps with planning ahead, so you can make predictions and understand what are the factors that are driving success, and then prepare and increase those factors, iteratively across the years. So, so that's the dream. And how do we actually get there is the question. So, to be able to get there, there's a few key approaches that we as Antares can help you with. And the very first thing that we typically do is what's called a data assessment. So a data assessment is essentially a process by which we come in and do a set of interviews. We look at your infrastructure, we look at your data assets, and we provide a set of key recommendations and a blueprint for how to take that next step. So often the question that I get asked is, well, this is where we are right now, but how do we actually move to that next level? How do we move to that next stage? And so what this data assessment does is it very clearly outlines where you are right now with all of the assets that you have in play, all the processes you have in place, and defines in an easy to execute way, the next step for you to enhance that environment, right? So wherever you are in that journey. So as I outlined, there's sort of three main buckets. Of course, there are variations on those three. People have done some AI without having a unified data strategy and so on. But the key from this data assessment is for us to help you identify where you are right now very clearly, structure that, and then provide clear next steps as a blueprint for you to take that next step towards your unified data strategy. Now, often what that next step is of course something like a fabric. So we might identify some key sources of information. We might identify that, hey, we have this clear use case for, so say, let's for example, a centralized student view, which is often a conversation at schools. That sort of sets a student-centric dashboard that has a high level set of information for a particular student or a cohort of students. So we might identify that, hey, that's a really good use case for us because at the moment we're kind of looking at siloed bits and pieces of information for each individual student. So out of the data assessment, often we take that next step to actually create an MVP or a proof of concept around the unified data management platform with a clear outcome that is of high impact, high value for that school. So together we establish that, hey, this is the view that we want that will provide high value to our learning and teaching group, for instance. And of course, the executives sign off on that and they say, yep, we believe that is going to be a high impact, high value for us. We then help to develop the initial stages and the foundations of your data platform by first using Fabric, but secondly, we have some accelerators that essentially is made up of a code base or a framework of code and some reporting that you can use to very quickly establish a unified data management platform using Fabric. So as opposed to coming in, with no experience with Fabric and no tool set, having to learn everything, having to implement the core things that very often you need to implement to make things work. We've done all of that work many times already. So we provide that as a free of charge open source code-based framework for you to leverage and accelerate that deployment. So part of that deployment, and often what we talk about as a strategy for that deployment is, as I already mentioned, identify your core data sources. Second, establish what's called a common data model. So that common data model is essentially a way for us to abstract all of our sources of data and provide a universal data model for us to leverage in whatever reporting we're doing. So whether that's Power BI, whether that's whatever reporting we're doing on the other side, we can abstract with this common data model. So we help you establish that, and we've implemented that many times, so it's something we can quickly build out for anyone. But it just helps to define what this universal data platform looks like for you, and then how do you actually then, and helps define how you interact and what are the processes for you to leverage insights out of that data management platform. So essentially, we do the data assessment, we understand what the landscape is, then we look at what the strategy or the steps are for you to take that next step. Then we actually help you take that next step by implementing Fabric with an established framework that then helps you to leverage the power of Fabric to get better insights into your data. And that gets you started along the way. Now, when we get to this point, I often get asked, well, what is a data lake, or why should we look at a data lake as opposed to a data warehouse? Traditionally, data warehouses have been around for 30 odd years. A lot of people understand them. A lot of people have implemented them at a lot of schools. So there might be some resistance to change here. And often what we talk about, and the whole reason for why data lakes have become a thing in the first place, is that it allows us to very quickly establish a data platform without having to put in a lot of upfront work. Okay, so whereas a data warehouse, we have to provide the structure up front, we have to provide all of the work up front before we get any value. In a data lake, we can simply upload all our information and then just hone in on the sections that we need initially, but very quickly get value out of that data lake, as opposed to the long-term investment we need to make in the data warehouse. So overall, it simplifies things whilst still providing security. So of course, Fabric and as various other platforms, key focus is simplicity, but with security. And we can then start moving towards what we call democratization of data. So what that means is we move away from IT having the accountability for data assets, and we push that accountability and ownership of those data assets out to the business, because the business effectively are the ones that are using that information. They are the ones that understand that information, so they should be accountable for that information. But we need to be able to do that in a way that's easy for them to consume and change and manage those data assets. And that's essentially what a data lake allows us to achieve using Fabric. So second question is, well, why specifically Fabric? Well, I've worked with all other platforms, including Snowflake, Databricks, and Synapse. And Fabric is kind of the next evolution of these management platforms. So typically what you would have seen in the past is, Synapse and Databricks. Those, whilst they're very good data management platforms, typically when I look at a Databricks, or when we recommend Databricks, it's mostly for like a mining or a banking type scenario, where we're looking at terabytes of information with really, really high performance requirements. For schools specifically, from a cost and simplicity of use perspective, Fabric has done a really good job at providing a low cost, easy to use SaaS platform that essentially encompasses, because it's a SaaS solution, encompasses all and abstracts all the complexity underneath, right? So I don't need to worry about infrastructure. I don't need to worry about all the things that I would typically with a Databricks or a Snowflake or a Synapse implementation. All I need to do is create a Fabric capacity and I'm up and running, right? And so, even from a security perspective, if you're already familiar with Power BI, it works the same way or very similar. So if I already have some Power BI experience, Fabric is as an easy to understand extension of what Power BI provides. It's even in the same workspace. So, it's essentially just an addition to what you've already seen in Power BI. So for us, our main recommendation typically for schools is especially for K-12, is Fabric, due to these reasons. Now, I just wanted to talk very, very high level about the architecture here as well, of how all these things are put together. So once we have established a clear use case and we're working towards building out this platform, some of the key considerations that go into building that platform are outlined here. So the first one is, well, how do I actually get my information into this data platform, right? So there's got to be a way or a process around data ingestion. And all of that is actually currently covered in our framework. So you don't have to actually worry about how this is done. Our framework purely simplifies this process by creating a configuration file that you can interact with, and you can just say, this is my source. These are the tables I want ingested. These are some of the details of how, and the framework does the rest for you. So it's a very quick and easy way to get your data in to Fabric. Then, of course, once we have our data in, we need a sort of structured strategy for how we manage that information. So, there's a process by which we might transform that data. So, for example, we might have a student's first name and surname as two separate columns. We might want to combine that for a report that we want to produce. So that's a transformation we might do in the actual data lake itself, or in the management platform, via some either SQL code or Python code, or whatever you're comfortable with, right? So that component there is typically the sort of customization of what the platform produces from the data that you ingest. Then, of course, the data modeling part. This is an important part, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier around creating a common data model. So you might say, Marty, what's a data model? So this is basically the structure that we provide on the data that we ingest. So as a typical example of that, you might have a student table that has student name, let's just, for example, it has student attendance in there, some demographic information. The data modeling aspect is really just about providing a structure around what that data looks like. So I might say that the name is a string value, the age is a number, and so forth and so forth. So it's a structure by which I can work with that information. And once I put that structure into place, I can then present or push that information in that structured way into my presentation layer. Okay, so that means Power BI reporting. It might also mean that you can, a few schools that I work with interact with their data using natural language. So very similar to what you would expect from a ChatGPT style interaction with data. We can create these prompt-based interactions with the data. So once you have that structure in place, you can ask the data questions. So you might say, what's, as a year 8 teacher, you could ask, what's my upcoming cohort's maths grade average from last year's year 7 cohort, right? And it will, provide a narrative around that and say, these were the average grades, and here's why. All leveraging existing data out of what you already have. So it's not just sort of static dashboarding here in the presentation layer. It can be interactive, and in addition to that, we're also moving away, or we're encouraging the movement away from those static dashboards in terms of providing notification-based information. So that might be that, a student, a particular individual student might be trending downwards in a certain subject, or behavioral issues are beginning to emerge. Now, if you go to a static dashboard each day to look at those trends, then you actually need to spend time in evaluating what's going on, as opposed to when something critical occurs, or when there's a trend or something that you need to be notified about. That information can be pushed to you specifically, so that then you are made aware of what's going on. Then you can go to the dashboard and evaluate further insights of, what from the information you might need at that particular point in time. So again, it's that automation and that time saving, while still delivering insights from the data that we have, is key to how we establish these platforms. And underpinning all of that with Fabric, of course, there is the security layer, the storage layer, which Peter mentioned already, how OneLake works. And then, of course, there's a development life cycle around that as well, which we introduce to make sure that we do the appropriate steps from development to production and all those other important aspects of developing out a data management platform as well. So those are the key things. In terms of the main outcomes, so I wanted to just share some real-world examples of some static dashboards. So I've mentioned some interaction approaches, some AI. In this particular case, I wanted to keep it simple and just talk about some real-world examples about what some potential dashboards might provide value to you as a school. One of my favorites, and often one of the key favorites for a lot of schools I worked with, is this sort of centralized correlation view across an entire cohort. So this could be a year 9 class. It could be an entire year level. The point is you can slice and dice that cohort in any way you want. And what it does is it provides a really clear view for, particularly for learning and teaching groups, what the outlier students are. So basically what it does is it takes your NAPLAN and your PAT result and your subject result and your attendance, which is a little bit hard to see because it's the size of the dots here, or the bubbles, and it correlates them into one clear visual. So as you can see here, this is a fairly good cohort because I can see that the NAPLAN mean, above NAPLAN mean and above PAT mean, falls into this quadrant here. So students that score high on those results should typically also get A's, right? So I've essentially put here the maths PAT test, the numeracy NAPLAN test, and mathematics as a subject. So typically what I'd like to see is green bubbles up on this top left-hand corner and then yellow to red bubbles down in this corner here. But oftentimes there might be one or two key students that are outliers, and you'll see green dots down here and yellow dots up there. So what that means is that students are scoring high on NAPLAN and PAT, but are getting C's and D's in the same subject. So why is that? You know, we can look at further into that and say, well, is that a typical teacher trend there, teacher potentially marking very harshly? Or has that student been away for a long period of time, but is actually quite a smart student? So if we can encourage them to attend more, maybe we can push up their marks. So these are the sort of key questions and conversations you can have with this, with this particular report. All right. And there are many, many variations of this as well. What you can't see here is, of course, there are some live pop-ups that actually pop up with the individual student details, what year the NAPLAN test was, all sorts of other sort of very detailed information. But at a high level, this gives you a really good snapshot of a particular cohort and where you might need interventions as well. Another example, and one of my other favorites is this sort of NAPLAN based on the new proficiency levels, I should say. So NAPLAN has changed the way they report on the proficiency levels last year, as most of you already probably know. And so this is essentially a snapshot of the different year levels and the buckets into which they fall into versus the national percentage. So essentially, if I look at a year 3 cohort here, I can see that the needs additional support group that falls into that particular NAPLAN test is below the national percentage. So that's good. If I were above here as a school, I'd be concerned. So then I'd need to look at, okay, how do I help that year 3 cohort develop better numeracy skills, for example, right? So it very clearly shows comparatively to the national percentage, what each cohort for each proficiency level, where they fall in comparison, right? And then you have the absent and withdrawn as well. But ultimately, the two key ones here, that schools look at, of course, are where am I exceeding and where do I need additional support, right? So again, very clear, concise picture of NAPLAN across the board. And this is actually a custom visual that we've developed. So this is not something that just happens out of Power BI naturally, but this is something that we can again help to develop at a school quite easily because we've done it so many times. The last one here is essentially a sort of longitudinal and trend analytics across a specific subject. So where this might be important is when you're having conversation with parents at whatever year level. So it's, saying, hey, Timmy's been trending upwards very clearly in mathematics here, or, there's been a downward trend, or, having those sort of wider conversations rather than just focusing in on semester 1, 2024, here's your result, and that's really it for that scope of conversation. You can look at a much longer term trend view and talk about that student in a more strategic way. How can we help this student increase, or, based on those trends, how can we help that student? Not only that, but it also helps in guidance in year 10 when that student is selecting a subject for year 11, 12. So you can look at that longitudinal view of that student and say, hey, by the way, Timmy, you've done really well here in mathematics, but you haven't chosen a mathematics subject for year 11. Why is that? And you can have those conversations, or vice versa. Timmy's chosen specialist maths, but has been consistently getting D's and E's throughout his, entire schooling career. Well, that's another conversation potentially to help that student as well. So, there's multiple uses for this. Typically, this is also aligned with another subject. So you can, on the same page, you can view maths and English and sort of correlate how that student's doing over the years across several different subjects. And again, this can be sliced and diced in many different ways. So the point is, all of these visuals are clear, simple, concise, and they enable conversations within your learning and teaching teams. Like I mentioned, there are also visuals for operationally, for finance and HR that provide sort of similar trends for planning and for sort of overview and a more sort of strategic guidance around those operational aspects. But the point is, and to reaffirm, the three key steps we take are an initial assessment of your environment. We take a look at some of those key priorities. You might already have some reporting. You might already have some gaps in that reporting. So we look at those. We identify something that adds value there. We then bring that into a fabric where we provide some structure and some guidance and a framework free of charge, open source, and then provide some of these reports that help you then establish better conversations, better key insights, and better outcomes for your students. So we've got a little bit of time left. I did want to make the offer as well. So there's a call to action here, and this is something that we've done many, many times before, where essentially for anyone that's on the call, if you email us, and you're one of the first 3 to email us, so oftentimes they come in all at once, but it's a race to the first 3 essentially. Well, you'll get a free data assessment. So we'll come in, we'll do an evaluation of your environment, and you'll get a specific recommendations report from that. As well as some guidance around what those next steps, should be for your specific use case. But that's all I have at this point. I'm happy to also take questions. So if anyone has any questions, and at this point, I'll hand over to Greg, if you want to conclude.
Yeah, no, perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Marty. Thank you, Peter. I've got a few questions, which probably I will pose to you as we wait for anyone in the audience who may have some questions as well. And probably just based on sort of what you shared. I'll start with yourself, Peter. Marty talked a little bit about Fabric in that sense, but understanding what we understand about K-12 schools and the variation between sizes and those sort of things, why is Fabric a good choice for even the smaller, littler schools with those at small headcount as a product and as a platform? Why does it make sense for those small schools? Because not every school has a large capacity of staff, as you know, and people to run a platform. Why is Fabric that sort of good choice for a smaller school?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a common question we do get asked as to, why Fabric for our school. And Marty touched on a couple of these points and I bring it down to simplicity. I think that's probably the best word to kind of sum up what Fabric really does bring to an organisation, that are typically limited in terms of resources. You may not have a large data practice, and the skill set. You may not have data engineers, data scientists, and a team of data administrators to do the ongoing day-to-day management of that data, the infrastructure and the your data estate. So I think from that perspective, in terms of streamlining a lot of the operations, in particular, when we think about the life cycle of ingestion and the reduction in the processing that necessarily would typically need to take place, is relatively more achievable by Fabric. The other key thing is a lot of it is it's very much catered to different personas. So you might have a data analyst at your school who might want to run reports and they want to run analytics on the data sources. So being able to cater to specific personas across the school and almost providing a more of a self-service type capability becomes more possible with Fabric as well. So I think there's that aspect as well that's quite useful for many schools.
So really, it's that sort of low requirement to manage and run and operate the platform, given it's a SaaS product and it's not the traditional Azure data services as we remember, which is requiring infrastructure and compute to be managed a little bit more, and also then the ability to sort of have that flexibility to serve different users within a smaller school. So if that's a reporting analyst, if that's someone who's simply just a teacher / reporting analyst, because let's be honest, a lot of teachers are sort of putting on that sort of dual hat and doing a little bit in the background as well. So it's really that sort of capability about having to worry about that large sort of team of people behind the scenes to run it can be set up, and it can be sort of put in their hands quite autonomously for sort of a lot more freedom and flexibility. So
yeah, just
summarize that right?
Yeah, so just to add to what Peter was saying there as well, I think the second key thing here, whilst definitely simplicity is number one, the second one is the simplicity of the transition. So if because oftentimes there are a lot of schools already that have embarked on some Power BI reporting, right? But they're pulling data directly from the source into Power BI, but they have some experience with what the workspace looks like, how does security work, some of the main components. So transitioning into Fabric from that perspective of already having done some Power BI work is a lot easier because the workspace is the same. It's just additional artifacts and additional tools in that workspace, as opposed to, a brand new platform that you've never seen before. So it's simplicity of the platform, but also the simplicity of the transitioning into that platform as well, which I think is key.
No, fantastic. That's a very good point as well. No, I did have a question coming back to you around that one as well, Marty. So you've solved that one already. Okay. That's okay. That's good. Because it was going to be that extensibility and reuse of what's already been done. Because you correctly point out, and we speak to a lot of schools who, already have that established, as I said, capability around Power BI or existing reports. They don't want to lose as well, and there's been an investment to get to this point as well. So sometimes, the natural inclination from our teachers, our principals can be, well, what everything we've done now has to go out the door whilst we rebuild. So it's great that you validate that, that's not the case. But I will pose a different question to you then, Marty, as well, around the Fabric framework you mentioned. What sort of source systems are you seeing out there that you're connecting into that are common across the ecosystem, or, those sort of things that are, I would say, there are scatterings of different systems in education, we understand that, but what are some of the ones that, are already, which schools are taking to what systems with good effect? Maybe I'll phrase it that way.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, as you can imagine, there are probably a handful of sort of student management systems that we come across. So things like TAS, Synergetic, Canvas as an LMS, these are sort of the more popular, type sort of sources. And then there's a scattering of other sort of point solutions at schools that they use for various things like, say, timetabling or, sort of point specific like behavioral data, like Schoolbox and, various other sort of bits and pieces. But typically, with TAS and Synergetic, it's sort of a fairly straightforward SQL database backend that we just connect into and pull that information out of. A lot of schools, as I mentioned, have sort of these point solutions where it's a SaaS-based product or SaaS-based application that offer API access. So the framework caters for all of those. So the framework we can essentially plug into either a database backend, an API backend. If you have various already data lakes established, we can plug into those. So we try to cater for as many sources as possible. And as we come across sort of new, particularly API type approaches, we extend out the framework based on that work, and it gets extended out over time. But for the most part, the most typical scenarios we have covered in the framework. So it's already ready to go. All you need to do is just, like I said, point it to the source, establish that configuration, and it'll pull that information into Fabric for you.
Beautiful, perfect. That's good. It's good to know, and it's good to hear, and hopefully all the attendees find that that useful in terms of what systems and how schools are doing it. And to extend on that, then I'll probably pose that to you, Peter, as well. You mentioned earlier around data being at the centre. We're talking student, we're talking staff, we're talking operations and services. What are you seeing from schools in terms of where they start looking at their data transformation journey? Because there are a lot of systems, as you sort of correctly pointed out, and there is that need to bring that data together. But are you seeing a trend or a leaning or a slant towards a particular area? Is it student data? Is it services data? Are you seeing something that's more prevalent than others?
Yeah, I think Marty touched on this very briefly. Where schools typically start, it's usually some of the, I guess, some of the more disparate rogue systems. Could be scheduling, timetabling, especially if they're starting, I guess, relatively fresh with Fabric. They tend to start with a lower complexity, lower impact type of data source where, it's a good place to start understanding how the platform operates, understanding the capabilities. But also what happens is we tend to see a parallel effort of skilling. So getting, individuals who may not have SQL background, even though SQL is relatively, I guess, a commodity skill set, but just really getting across the technology and being able to skill the team while rolling out and transitioning some of those data sources is typically what we tend to see. So sometimes we also see what is quite common as well, and I know we didn't really touch on this in today's webinar, is transitioning from Synapse to Fabric. So this is a very common scenario that we're starting to have a number of schools reach out to us and look for assistance. And obviously that transition is relatively streamlined as well. So a lot of the skills are transportable, which is beneficial. The security models in terms of taking advantage of the integration to existing security structures, thinking about role-based access controls, and a lot of the technologies that schools have already rolled out are things that can be directly adopted and taken advantage of as schools transition to Fabric.
Oh, fantastic. I think that they're very good call outs and good points. And I'll again sort of touch on a little bit more around what you touched on around governance and security to Marty now as well, in the sense of, Marty, you talk about the assessments and you come in and you do that. Again, I'll maybe pose that same question again slightly differently to what I posed to Peter. It was again a simulation of a small school, small head count. We don't have the ability to look around the room and see a data governance person, a stewardess, someone that can maintain this type of role, a data custodian here, there. How do we manage that? And as a school, when we don't have all these roles, what's your advice to us as a small school to be able to actually take on board, the learnings, and how do we fill in these gaps? Because we only have a couple of people, 2, 3, 4 people that have to manage this. And you sort of mentioned a lot of roles. What would your typical recommendation be, or how would you sort of approach it? And you don't have to go into detail, but just give us some idea around how you would do that and the advice you would give.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'll start by saying that one of the first things that I come across most often is a lack of policy within schools. So that policy might be, simple things like subject naming conventions, right? So, something like having a math subject called mathematics in year 8, and then maths in year 9, and then specialist math. Like so essentially, a lack of policy around something as simple as that can create an environment where it's very difficult to report on universally across the board, right? So simple things like that become valuable when you're unifying that strategy, right? So often what we recommend there is initially focusing on and creating a set of policies that are, that establish those rules around how you engage with the data. So if I'm entering a name, for example, it's got to be this long or this short, whatever it may be. If I'm entering a code, it's got to be of this, this sort of structure. However, oftentimes schools don't have the budget for an FTE, or even a half, even a sort of half FTE to provide those facility or provide that service. So, we can offer a couple of things there. Initially, we can offer some guidance around how the policy should look like, but we can also provide things like a sort of managed service around that. So basically a sort of half-time resource or a resource that you can leverage as a school from us that helps you establish those policies initially. And then the second part of that is, once you establish those policies and the data management platform with those rules, how do you sort of continually drive that? And that often happens to schools where they sort of build it and they then don't think about it for a little while. So it doesn't continue to provide value. So when you build a platform like Fabric, you need to continually drive and innovate and push push the usage of that so it sort of grows. And so part of that is potentially somebody that understands how to engage with the business, which sometimes schools already have. Part of that is, how do I turn those business requirements into a technical solution using Fabric and Power BI? And part of that is having an understanding of the data engineering aspects that go into the back end. So again, while schools might have one or two of those pieces, they don't often have all three. So again, we can either provide guidance around how or fill those gaps as well for that school for some period of time until they transition somebody in or hire somebody, or whatever that sort of longer term strategy might look like. But so we certainly sort of look at those pieces and then find where the gaps are, make those recommendations on how to fill those gaps, and then if required, we can assist in filling those gaps as well for either a short or a longer term as well.
Perfect. That's great. I think that probably it helps a lot as well. And then probably to Peter's point earlier around the power of the platform requiring, that low overhead of hands-on, it probably is a massive boost as well, that you don't need to have that large-scale investment is what I'm hearing. So that's a good understanding of that as well. And you touched on rules and policies and governance, and letting the rules-based approach take over. So it's not a case of having to have lots of hands on deck and eyes looking at clocks and dials. The rules and the policies which get set up will be, essentially helping keep the platform well governed, well managed, and can keep the quality of the data coming through. And I think that's a good point, and it's also probably a good little segue to remind everyone that we are back again next week on our webinar 2, which is at mastering information management and governance as well. So it's another extension of the governance conversation into other areas, but essentially everything with data, as Peter talked about earlier. Data is at the heart of all of our schools. Well managed, well governed data landscape helps, but there's also other areas as well of the school, of our organisations, that we need to also manage well, especially when it comes to our information management or information architecture, and then the policies and tools and controls around that as well. So we'll be back next week for that session as well. So make sure that you do sign up to these 3 webinar series. The 2 more are coming along. We are endeavouring here at Antares, along with the help of Microsoft, to make sure you're ready for 2025 with all the information you need to have. So as you start to look and embark on those new initiatives for next year, you're well placed with this series, really giving you a good run in as we turn through Christmas. So these series is designed specifically towards yourselves. We're happy to take your feedback as well on how we tailor these to give you more compelling content and really make this a series that you get the most benefit out of. So as we've just hit the hour of 12 o'clock and we're right on time, I shall thank everyone for their attendance. I will thank the wonderful Peter Venukian from Microsoft for his fantastic insights and presentation. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Marty Marek from Antares, who's given us an understanding of how they go about data transformation. And I thank you all for joining us, for being engaged in the poll. If there's any questions, any follow-ups, feel free to reach out. As Marty touched on earlier, there is a call to action there where you can have a look at, a potential free data assessment, or if you just want more information about that, feel free to reach out as well. as we start to look at 2025, it's going to be a big year for a lot of schools. And I know digital transformation ranks highly up there with a lot of principals in terms of what they want to see happening in 2025. So feel free to reach out to any of us. And from me at Antares, I'm Greg Brown. Thank you for your time today and this morning, and earlier morning, as Peter mentioned, for those on the West Coast. And thanks for today's session for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.